Okay, thank you everybody for actually joining this Lesson Applied Science webinar series. I'm Dr. Clifford Chua, and I'm the Managing Editor for the Earth and Environmental Science section of the journal. And our guest speaker today is Dr. Epule Terence, who is currently an Assistant Professor and Chair of Climate Change Adaptation and Sustainability Strategy in Africa at the International Water Research Institute at Mohammed Polytechnic University in Morocco. Prior to joining the Mohammed VI Polytechnic University in Morocco, he served in a similar capacity at the Université La Salle in France. Before that, he was a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Geography at McGill University and University of Montreal, respectively. He has a PhD in environmental sciences from the University of Quebec in Montreal. Today, he will be talking to us about his research, which is actually focused on climate change adaptation and sustainability strategy in Africa. Particularly, he will be talking about a paper that he published in Essence Applied Sciences, which is focused on identifying and accounting for maize yield gaps in Uganda. Please, before I hand over the session to Dr. Epule, I would actually like to ask all the participants to switch off the camera and mute themselves so as to allow him to present his work with little interruption. If you have any question, please type it in the chat box and I'll read it to him at the end. And if alternatively, you can unmute yourself at the end of his presentation and post your question. Dr. Epule, without further delay, please, you can proceed with your presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chua, for this wonderful presentation. I do appreciate it. I must say that it was a very, very generous presentation. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining this webinar organized by Springer Nature Applied Sciences. I just want to thank the entire Springer team for this opportunity to further valorize our results by having this platform on which present some of our initial findings. I also want to thank all the participants for their collaboration and for their time. And I see that my colleague, Dr. Professor Victor Nguma is right there. Thank you for presenting the International Water Research Institute. Hopefully others will join us as we roll on. So I'm just gonna kick off there. So today we'll be discussing one of our recent publications titled Identifying Maize Yield and Precipitation Gaps in Uganda, that was published in March, precisely accepted on the 20th of March 2021 in Springer Nature Applied Sciences. So I won't go into presenting myself any longer. Dr. Chua did an excellent job. So I'm just going to skip this slide. So perfect. So generally, the kind of research I carry out is at the interface of the interactions between climate change, agriculture, and adaptations. My current position is as Assistant Professor of Climate Change Adaptations and Sustainability Strategies in Africa. So I try to see how agricultural systems, farming systems, crop types, crop varieties, and diets interact with climatic variables. And within this context, my aim is always to come out with different aspects of adaptations, either technical, indigenous, social, or economics. So I use essentially empirical-based models, as well as participatory approaches. And I depend a lot on historical or time series data to be able to see exactly what's happening in terms of the interactions between cropping systems and climatic variables and associated adaptation options. So in a nutshell, I'm in between as an environmental scientist that specialized in agricultural and land use. I tend to be in between these variables, and it's not uncommon for environmental scientists to touch different aspects. So sometimes they call us jacks of all trades, but masters of none. But in this case, at least we try as much as possible to bring in this multi-disciplinary facet. And that's why when you see publications like this, we have experts from different domains, agronomy, climate, and agriculture, and things like that that come in to make sure that all the different aspects are covered. So going into the crux of the matter, we're talking about yield and precipitation gaps in Uganda. So let's have a little bit of the background. So Uganda, as you can see, is located in sub-Saharan Africa, especially in East Africa. It has a satellite climate in the north, especially if you go to the areas that are close to Sudan, southern Sudan, around Karamoja. According to the United Nations, in recent projections, it has a population of about 47 million. Has a humid equatorial climate with rainfall amounts of about 800 to about 1,500 millimeters of rainfall. And that rainfall is bimodal, especially for maize production in the south, which means that they have a dual growing season. And in the north, it is unimodal. Now, agriculture, for sure, it's a very important activity in most of Africa, and Uganda is no exception. Agriculture accounts for 20% of the GDP of the country, the gross domestic product, about 48% of export earnings, and also employs about 73% of the population. So it's an important sector, after the government, it's a major employer in the country. So, and this seems to be very consistent with most African countries that we've worked in. Now, the next thing is why the emphasis on the crop maize, why are we looking at maize yield and precipitation gaps in Uganda? The first amongst this is because maize is amongst the most widely cultivated crops, in Africa, amongst crops like wheat, rice, soybeans, barley. It's a prominent crop. It's also consumed in different ways, which means that once it is grown, it can be consumed as fermented dough, corn porridge. There's even what we call corn beer. For those who have been to Africa and lived there, there's local corn beer, so it's a very, very important crop. In addition, about 70 to 80% of the producers, something that's very significant, of maize in Uganda, and this is consistent with most of sub-Saharan Africa, are small-scale farmers. They are inadequately adapted, inadequately equipped. They are mostly poor and not highly mechanized. And it's a crop that has a huge range of tolerance. If you would realize that it's grown in the south as well as in the north, though with varied rates of productivity. So that's the context, that's the country in East Africa that we are dealing with. Now, the concept of yield and precipitation gaps. Now, when we look at that, we could say that yield gaps occur when the projected yields for, say, a given crop are above the actual yields for that crop. So as you can see on the graph that we have on the left, we'll discover that the area in the middle between the pink and the blue curves establishes the gaps, because we discover that in that case projected yields are above actual yields. Now, precipitation gaps, on the other hand, in very plain and simple terms, occur when projected precipitation, the amount that is forecasted, is usually above what is actually obtained. Now, it's very important to understand that when agroeconomists, climatologists, project crop yields and precipitation, they base their projections on precipitation, temperature, soil types, farming systems, population numbers, and land use systems to be able, so all of that information is used to say that, to say the next year, for example, we expect the yields to be at this rate. Now, if that projected amount of yield is not attained, based on all these variables that they're taking into consideration, then a gap is said to have been established, and that can affect the society in different ways. It can lead to issues of food insecurity, amongst others. Now, I haven't had that context. The next issue is that why are yield and precipitation gaps important in Africa in general? So we have to be able to establish that, to be able to go to why this type of research is important. Why is it important to study yield gaps? Why is it important to study precipitation gaps? Now, there I have a figure from Ayambra and Turka that they published in the Journal of Arid Environments in 2005, which of course shows that there's been a lot of variations in precipitation, as well as normalized difference vegetation index across most of sub-Saharan Africa. over the years. Now, when you look at this figure that you see here, you would see that from the 1930s right up to, I would say, 1960s, or let me say the 1970s, yeah, there were droughts, there were periods of negative anomalies, as you can see there. However, from around the 1970s, you would remember, was an era when most of sub-Saharan Africa, especially the Sahel, began experiencing astronomical amounts of droughts. The droughts of the late 60s, the early 70s, and most of them ended up around the mid 1980s. So there was a lot of decline in precipitation during that period. So this figure shows us that we had a lot of negative anomalies during that period. And this was also reflected in the normalized difference vegetation index, which is a proxy for precipitation that declined substantially. So, however, I beg your pardon, during that same period, it was very consistent with high astronomical rates of food insecurity amongst most of the Sahel, wherein World Food Program had to intervene in many countries, including places like Ethiopia, to provide food aid. Now, recent research, however, shows that from 1985, for example, things have been changing. The Sahel is recovering. It's becoming greener, as we can see from NDVI related studies, as well as in terms of precipitation. So there are changes. So it is very important, therefore, to be able to analyze, the gaps that exist in crop use, especially in crops like maize that are widely cultivated, that are staple crops for most African countries, as well as in the context of all of the people to understand whether the projected amounts of precipitation that have been projected for different countries do actually tally or match with what actually obtains in the ground. So that is one of the reasons why it's important to delve into this kind of analysis to be able to better understand food insecurity and be able to propose measures. Now, in addition to that, if you just look at it from the precipitation perspective of why it's important to look into yield and precipitation gaps, if we look at the mean annual rainfall across regions of Africa from 1991, for example, to 2016, we would see that for different regions of Africa, this is subject to recent publication that we had. So you would see that generally West Africa, for example, in terms of rainfall, consistent with what we had in the previous study year, is experiencing like the higher amounts of rainfall, as you can see from the brown, the brown curves representing West Africa, whereas the next there will be Middle Africa, and then where we are based in North Africa, Maghreb, they are experiencing the least amounts of precipitation. So across Africa, there's still a lot of variation. So in as much as the Sahel and West Africa are experiencing higher amounts of rainfall, other regions of the world like the Maghreb are experiencing relatively lower amounts of rainfall, as you can see there. So it's very important to go into the nitty-gritty of what's happening within different countries, be able to see exactly what the case applies to be. Now, if you look at things like other data respect to changes in vegetation, here we have the same study by Ayaba and Turka, who discovered that since the early 1980s, right up to about 2003, there's been an evolution in normalized difference vegetation index. Now, if you look at there, we have yellowish. If you look at most of Africa from Senegal, West Africa, stretching into East Africa, and within the yellow or the 0.05 NDVI change rate. So that's an enormous change, which shows that if you go further, for example, into this, you would see that if you compare what obtained in terms of NDVI, normalized difference vegetation index across West Africa, you would see that in 1981, already, the area was regaining because the droughts that had hit the continent, in the decades prior were already subsiding. And then you go into 1999, the area is even getting greener. And NDVI is a proxy for increased precipitation. So that tallies, there's a lot of correlation between increased greening right now and increased precipitation in the region. But yet, the big question is, why is there still so much food aid security in the region? Some of the questions that we'll be investigating detailedly when we look at the situation in in Uganda. Now, see from a climate perspective, I'll just rush over this. It shows us, again, from a regional perspective, what temperatures have looked like since 1991. This is the recovery period of precipitation, of course, where the area, sub-Saharan Africa or the Sahel is getting greener. But when we look at all of this information here, we discover that, again, West Africa, tends to record some of the highest temperatures, as well as the Maghreb that experience very low precipitation generally. So the Maghreb is experiencing high temperatures, low precipitation, whereas West Africa, for example, or most of the Sahel is beginning to experience high temperatures and at the same time, very, very high precipitations or increasing rates of precipitation as seen on this figure here. Now, other reasons why this type of studies are important has to do with just the increasing recurrent climate stressors across the most of Africa. So yeah, we're beginning to discover from a systematic review that across most of Africa, especially within the Sahel, there's been an evolution in the type of climatic stressors that we have. In the 60s and 70s, we had more researchers focusing on droughts. And thereafter, there's been a shift from droughts into analysis that focus mostly on floods, not because they are no longer droughts, but because the 60s and the 70s were a period where, of the news media, we all know about the droughts that hit Africa. And subsequently, as the droughts began to subside, researchers have moved into floods, and finally, they're focusing also on sandstorms and things like that, which are the less which are the climate stressors which scientists are less focused on in the region. So with this kind of fluctuations, it's also important to be able to go into the details to see the precipitation gaps in particular, and to be able to understand why they exist and how these are driving, crops. And also, there's been a fluctuation in what is responsible for, these stressors. Increasingly, most of the studies attribute the stressors to climate change, of course, but there's an increasing attribution also to non-climatic factors. And now, most special issues are calling for studies that try to explain the contributions, the roles of climatic and non-climatic drivers in influencing crop yields of food security and insecurity in different parts of the world. Now, almost finally, in terms of the reasons, why it is very important. This is also a product of a recent study, which shows that, grosso modo, in a nutshell, the different parts of Africa are differentially ready to adapt to the changes in precipitation and temperature across Africa. And the first figure there that you see there, there we will present what we call a readiness index for climate change adaptation. So you see different regions of Africa all covered. The nutshell here is that even though the areas in green, North Africa, tend to experience high temperatures and low precipitation, they seem to be the most adapted, followed by Southern Africa. And West Africa, for example, which is experiencing more precipitation, high temperatures, unfortunately, is the least ready based on this kind of analysis. So it's very important to go into these regions to find out more. The rest of the figures there are just a representation of the literacy rates and the poverty rates for the different regions, which are very consistent with their adaptive capacity for those different areas. This is the methodology on which this index is based. So I'll just skip that. Literacy rates, I already mentioned that they are evolving a lot. You will discover that the areas that are most ready for adaptation, for example, are North Africa. So they tend to have higher literacy rates, while areas like Sub-Saharan Africa, West Africa, stretching into East Africa, are the least adapted areas. In terms of poverty, it's the same thing. You will see that the lower poverty rates are around the Maghreb, the Southern Africa, and the higher ones are around West Africa, stretching into Middle Africa and East Africa. Very consistent with that. So what I want to bring forth here is that the level of adaptation in the context of precipitation and yield gaps, the level at which societies will cope will not only depend on the magnitude of the stressor, how much deficits in maize we have, how much deficits in precipitation we have, but it will be a function of how well societies can adapt to this. So let's go now into our methods, and then we'll look at a few results, and then we can discuss. Now, for the current paper in Springer Nature Applied Sciences, I want to give you a bigger picture. That paper is a product of a bigger project that we're developing. So here we have a new Pan-African platform for crop yield precipitation gaps, crop calendars for selected crops in Africa. So it's good to give you that context, which has several work packages. We have 5 work packages. Now, the first work package there includes, of course, the knowledge synthesis, which involves a systematic review of the gray and the peer review literature to be able to respond to questions like crop types that have been studied. In this case, maize. We are looking at wheat and other crops for other PhD students and maybe postdocs in the future. Now, what are the drivers of the use that are expressed in the existing literature? What are the drivers of like precipitation gaps expressed in the literature? And of course, different search engines can be used. So systematic reviews can increasingly serve as an opportunity to be able to have a holistic picture of what the scientific literature has been focused on, and provides a unique opportunity to bring all of that knowledge into one and provide, a kind of internal view that cannot be provided by a single study. Now, work package 2 is what this current paper is actually focused on. It has to do with national and catchment area yield and precipitation gaps. Now, the first approach has to do with the use of empirical models, time series data, multiple linear regressions, non-linearly square regressions, and that's exactly what the current paper has been working on. Now, the other part of the project would involve the use of process-based models like aqua crop, eco crop, and different other models to be able to work at a catchment area scale and predict yield and precipitation gaps. Now, most of these models will be able to have inputs on a daily time step basis of precipitation, evapotranspiration, and all of those soil conditions and altitudes, and will be able to simulate over a long period of time the responses of these different crops, to these different inputs. So for now, the current study is based on the first approach. So we're working on getting team members to participate in all of these, and funding to be able to test and see how consistent, process-based models could, play a role in further enlightening our understanding of precipitation and crop yield gaps. Now, the next part of this, I'll just go over it fast, has to do with precipitation and perceptions of precipitation and yield gaps, which is also very important. So after doing all the modeling, work package 2 definitely would focus on finding out what the farmers themselves think, what the key informants think about the past and the future in terms of their crop use, either for maize as well as their precipitation, for the future. It's very important to have this kind of a perspective because they have a kind of knowledge that you as a researcher, you don't have. So we can now compare these perceptions with what the models say. And sometimes it's very interesting. Unfortunately, most of these models that we see in work package 2 are not by these perceptions. And there's a study by Giannini et al. In 2008 that says that even though precipitation is increasing in most of the Sahel, this is based on NDVI, for example, which covers information for large areas. It's important to go down into specific countries, specific communities to see exactly if that's the situation. And in some cases, it doesn't happen. In some cases, it happens. So we have to consider some of those results with caution. Now, the fourth work package, of course, has to do with how to close the gaps. So using nutrient and water management options. And the last option has to do with getting the information to stakeholders through the creation of a platform. First of all, an app that will make the information available to farmers. For example, if, the data shows that in the next season, the planting dates for maize will change, then they will be able to receive this information on their cell phones and things like that. But most importantly, researchers across the world will be able to go online, and there's a tool that they will be able to click, and a map of Africa will pop up, from which, by selecting what they want, selecting a given country or a different longitude and latitude, they will be able to see, the yield gap situation for that particular locality. So that's the long, and the context within which this publication is within. Now, the analysis of the data that we use in this study, essentially, the actual observed maize yield data spanned from 1998 to 2017 was obtained from 4 stats for maize, while the actual observed grain season precipitation was obtained from the World Bank Climate Portal for the same period. Actually, this data, if you click on it, is actually, most of it is informed by the CMEP5 processes and stuff like that. So they have a lot of collaboration with all those great modeling projects. Now, once this data was obtained, we are looking at precipitation and yield gaps. So on the left, we have the processing of the actual observed maize yield data. So this was subjected to detraining. Now, detraining is done for a number of reasons. For example, to remove the repercussions of technology and to reduce the effects of consistency in errors in reporting, and to take off, of course, linear patterns in the data. Now, once that was done, we computed projected yields using the equation that you have there, which is projected y is equals to 536.45x plus 14543. So when you plot, for example, this can very easily be achieved when you plot the time series of the data and you plot in the linear regression, for sure. You can now have that equation that can be used to estimate the projected yield. And once you have the projected yield, the difference between the projected and the actual will give you the yield gap. Same for precipitation. So precipitation, of course, we got the data from the World Bank Climate Portal. And then, of course, this was based on, for the case of Uganda, it was a function of the growing season. Because remember, we said the crop grows in the south and in the north of the country. And in the south, it's bimodal, whereas in the north, it's unimodal. So once all of that was done, we had the resultant projected yield equation that we have there. And the difference between the projected yield and the actual yield enabled us to obtain the yield gap for the country based on these empirical methods. Now, this is the crop calendar that was used to run this. So as you can see there, you have the north. The green represents when maize is grown in Uganda. In the north, in the south, you have April, May, and you have November and stuff like that. So all of this was used to determine the grain season precipitation for maize for the country. Now, just to let you know that there are similar studies that have used similar approaches. For example, if you use those that used our approach, for example, we have one by Hartfield and Bells. They use regression-based approaches to be able to, just the similar methods. There's also the one that was published in Nature by Mueller and others in trying to close yield gaps, through nutrient and water management options. They created, they were able to establish the differences between projected and observed yields using some of the methods that we've used. Whereas on the other hand, those that use process-based models, you can see the other two studies there. They use wolf cells models, just like what I was explaining, that part of our goal will be able to verify some of this within other parts of Africa. So these are just some examples. Now, some of the results involved here. First of all, the first results that there's a lower actual maize yield over projected maize yield. The long and short here is that in Uganda, between 1998 and 2007, overall, there's a lower actual maize yield. The amount of maize that was, harvested for most of the years, not all, most of the years, is generally below the projected, as you can see there. So that's something that, goes a long way to establish the information that we are trying to put for. For example, if you look at the graph that is on the left, you would see that the blue represents what was actually obtained, while the other color there represents the projected. So if you look at the years that we had gaps, maize would be 1998, for example, and then we also have around 2004 right up to 2007, and then we have from 2015 to 2017. So there are three gaps there, three periods of gaps there that were noted. And if we look at the growing season precipitation, during the same period, you would see that there were more periods wherein the projected precipitation was higher than the actual precipitation. So you would see most of the periods around 1999, right up to 2001. You would see from 2004 to 2005. You would see 2008, 2009, and then towards the end of the year, right, from 2014 right up to 2017. So those periods also had growing season precipitation gaps. So now, if you put all of that together and make a comparison, you would discover that, when we talk about years with yield gaps, we already mentioned that there were three key periods, right? 1998 had a yield gap. Unfortunately, during that year, there was no precipitation gap. If you look at what we've just seen, so it's interesting. There was a yield gap, there was no precipitation gap, because we would expect that when there's a yield gap, there should be a precipitation gap, but that was not the case. Now, 2004, 2007, we had a yield gap, and there was also a parallel precipitation gap. 2016, 2017, there was a yield gap and there was a parallel precipitation gap. Now, 2000, 2001, there was a precipitation gap, yet there was no yield gap. So it is important to note that some years of yield gaps are associated to precipitation gaps, while some years of yield gaps had no precipitation gaps. While on the other hand, some precipitation gap years had no yield gaps. So it's important to note that crop yield is a complex issue that is driven by both climatic and non-climatic drivers. And the key result here is that we cannot only subscribe to climate, we cannot only subscribe to changes in precipitation as the main drivers of crop production again in Africa. Yes, precipitation is important, but it's beginning to show that, some years when we had yield gaps, there were no precipitation gaps. So definitely there was enough precipitation. Then we can therefore say that this is not speculation, but it becomes important to verify the role of other variables, in explaining. Now, this study is not essentially an accounting. We're working on accounting for those gaps. But if you look at the literature, especially in Uganda, for example, it begins to show that some of the years where we had yield gaps and no precipitation gaps were associated to other outbreaks of pests, diseases that ravage maize, as you see. So if you look at the scatter plots, for example, of scatter plots of rain season precipitation and maize yield, we discovered that on the right, for example, on the left, we have, for example, actual maize grain season precipitation and the actual maize yield. Yeah, okay, we have a coefficient of determination of 60%. Quite balanced. Precipitation increases, actual maize yield increases. But on the other hand, if you look at the relationship that the projected precipitation would have with the actual, in the beginning, when it increases, there's an increase in actual production, but thereafter it begins to decline. So it begins to herald in the notion that it is not just the amount of precipitation that matters. Also, it has to do with the distribution, how well it is distributed within the growing season, and there are other variables that come into play. So yields do not always increase with increase in precipitation. It depends on how well distributed the precipitation is. It depends on the soil types. It depends on the farming systems. All of that comes into play, and even the pests, that affect the crops at some point in time, because you might have sufficient rainfall, but if the crops are not tolerant to pest outbreaks, then it definitely becomes an issue in the area. So in perspective, therefore, we can say that precipitation is, of course, an important crop yield determinant. As we can see, it's still important. As we can see from evidence across Africa, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, West Africa, is spreading to East Africa, Middle Africa. There's been increased NDVI, increased precipitation. Yet we're talking about food security every day. Yields are declining, yield gaps are occurring. So even though precipitation is important, it's always important to delve beyond precipitation and look into other variables, because other variables, as we can see from other studies, authors are beginning to subscribe to land use systems, to crop pest and diseases. So that's very important. In addition to that, however, there are several years, like in our results of yield gaps, that are not associated to precipitation gaps. That just goes for that to re-emphasize the importance that if you have yield gaps and then there are no precipitation gaps, then you can only look for those gaps from other drivers. So in the future, we're hoping that will be accounting. Where we just identifying will be accounting. We're trying to use our discussion to understand exactly what's happening. Furthermore, crop production is a very complex issue that cannot be explained by precipitation alone. That's the kind of conclusion that we're taking. And yield gaps, for example, recorded between 2000 and 2007 were associated, for example, to an outbreak of green leaf spot disease and stem borers in Uganda. So when we discovered that during this period there were yield gaps, but there were no precipitation gaps, we went in to find out, and we discovered that during this period, you had this pest, you had what we call outbreak of green leaf spot disease and stem borers in Uganda that affected the production of maize enormously. That's why the projected amounts of production were not attained. Also, yield gaps of the years 2015, 2017 were associated to outbreaks of also lethal necrosis and before worms. These are all different types of pests that affect the crops. So this goes a long way to explain how non-climatic variables also play an important role. Climate is still there, don't get me wrong, but it makes a bad situation even worse. But there are other drivers that are coming in. Now, yield analysis require comprehensive analysis beyond the climatic drivers, and there's a need for studies that attribute yields to both climatic and non-climatic drivers. So, furthermore, there's a need for studies that explore the raw historical data as well as, project these relationships into the future. So, thank you so much for your kind attention, and if you have any questions, any comments, over to you, Dr. Chua.
Yeah, thank you very much for such an insightful presentation, especially on an important topic for the African continent. I think not just for the African continent, climate change and impact on agriculture is one of the biggest problems that we have to try to resolve. So I have some questions that I would like to pose, and if any of the attendees have questions, please, you can unmute yourself or you can type it in the chat box and I'll read it to Dr. Epule. My first question to you is, what do you think policymakers can learn from your finding?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Chua. That's a very important question that you asked there, because at the end of the day, these findings are important for different stakeholders. And in Africa, for example, the policy framework is a key one, wherein the government sets the national policy for agriculture, for climate change, because most of these farmers have, as we said, about most of this production is in the hands of peasant farmers that are very poor, So it is believed that all the stakeholders, especially at the level of the government, because they are the ones that directing agricultural policy, have to use these results to be able to understand exactly the years within which these gaps have occurred and how precipitation gaps are linked to yield gaps, and be able to use this information and go down to the farmers in different ways, digitally, sensitization. So we are doing our own part, like researchers, to be able to go there, and that's why we are having the aspect where we're meeting with the key informants, and those key informants are policymakers in the Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Climate Sciences, and all whatnot in Kampala. So it will be their own opportunity as well to valorize this information and get this information down, right down there to the farmers, but most importantly, maybe collaborate with us, because our goal is to get an app and an online tool. But that tool will be useless, because at the end of, if the local peasants don't have that information, so I think that it will be left for us, as well as the government will continue to put pressure that they will get a policy of sensitization, wherein they will educate the farmers on how to use these apps in the future, how to use this information, maybe beginning from just telling them in very plain terms what is happening, in their region, what is happening. And then in encouraging them in the future to get these free apps, because like I was in Karamoja for 2 weeks in north of Uganda, most of these farmers, they have cell phones. They don't speak, some of them don't speak English, but they have cell phones. So if they can have this app on which this information comes down, and they are told by their own local community organizations, because they believe so much in those organizations, and they're not welcoming of others unless you pass through those organizations, then that information is going to go down. They're sensitized on how to use that, and to know that next growing season is going to begin late, and they have that information on their cell phones, and they have someone to help them interpret it, or they have been trained on how to do that. It's going to go a long way to adjust, because if not, they have in their head their specific dates which they have to plant, and they'll go ahead and plant. And if the forecast holds that for the next year, because of what happened subsequently, they'll not be able to have precipitations will not come on time, and they might end up having poor use, as is the case. So policymakers have to collaborate with researchers. All of it's like, a synergy wherein all stakeholders have to come together to use this information to educate their people, sensitize them, and to prepare to sensitize them so that they can use these apps, because they're very apprehensive of outsiders. Can use these apps to inform their planting decisions. So it should be a top priority for those agricultural ministries and climate change ministries involved. But we have to put the pressure, because sometimes we discuss these things. I don't want to be judgmental. Once we leave, no further actions are made. So we have to keep on putting the pressure, positive, to work as a team to get this information down and to impact policy.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have one last other question, one additional question before I hand over the session to any other person who have a question. There's an increasing need, especially for this kind of integrated study, to also look at some of the measures that were agreed under the Paris Agreement that are currently being rolled out. For instance, some countries, especially in Central Africa, have started receiving money to protect the forest.
Yes.
You know that deforestation has constantly provided farmland for some of these farmers. And some of this money maybe will end up maybe being provided as subsidies to farmers and maybe through other measures. So there's this need now for a lot of this integrated assessment model to incorporate some of these measures, how some of these measures will impact farming decision. Do you see this as a positive way forward in order to maybe get a better, provide policymakers with better result that can help them explore alternative actions?
Yes, Dr. Chua, you raised a very pertinent question. That's something that we've been working on. If you look at in the past, when I was at the University of Montreal, we worked on READ+, reduction of emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, which is part of the final. You also have the NEMA program, which are those financial incentive programs for mostly in Africa for reductions of emissions from degradation, which means that there's compensation, if farmers reduce. You mentioned something that is very strategic, like they depend on enhancing their farmlands by cutting off more forests. So most of these strategies from NEMA, from READ+, are aimed at reducing incentives to cut more forests, so that if they go into, say, agroforestry, for example, and save their trees, and integrate trees into their farms, they would gain. But I believe that the current strategy, to be honest, in Africa, yeah, they're motivated by the money, so to say, but there's a problem. And you likely mentioned that, you rightly said it, maybe the use of an integrated approach that brings strategies from different disciplines will play a very important role, because right now, if you look at the structure of the program, most of these farmers are only interested in getting the money, and in the long run, there is no follow-up. So they get the money, for saving trees on their farms. In the long run, they are still pressured. They are still pressured because they want to expand their farmlands. And when the organizations are no longer there, they go back and cut these trees for firewood. And they believe that the only way, in which they can enhance their yields is, for example, by cutting this land. There's a study that we're hoping that will come out. Actually, it's an African-based study that also shows that there's a strong correlation between farmland expansion, like deforestation and farmland expansion, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, most of Middle Africa and all those regions. So by integrating the multidisciplinary approach wherein you're bringing expertise from different areas, that would involve a change of mentality, and not only the financial intensive domain, but maybe I don't want to use the word punitive, but a balancing situation wherein those that cut more, like a polluter pay kind of policy, those that cut, that cut more, would pay for any extra trees cut above their quotas, and that money will be used to instead serve as an incentive for those that maintain. But policy-wise, intervention-wise, there must be a follow-up, and a big issue is the follow-up, because these projects come, the people sit. Once they have their objectives, they receive the money, they cut the trees again. And recent data, shows that there is still a very strong correlation. At least for the Maghreb, it's not the case. For Southern Africa, it's not the case. But for most of West, Middle, and East Africa, deforestation is highly linked to farmland expansion, agricultural production, although the yield productions are not following suit. So I think that it's a very good idea to integrate, follow up, to integrate better motives for incentives into most of these programs like Read Pros and NEMA, to be able to achieve, the sustainability of this kind of projects, and of course bringing expertise from different areas, from policy, from agroforestry in particular, because sometimes those trees. Imagine that he plants a tree and gets the money, right? Why does he cut the tree? Because of the type of tree. There was a study that we published on enabling conditions of successful greening of public places. And one of the issues was that, apart from the fact that most of the farmers didn't have ownership, one of the problems was the type of trees that are grown. So policy has to shift towards, even the researchers, you don't just go and introduce trees because they're ecologically good, but what about fruit trees? So that they can have sustained economic levels, they can diversify their livelihoods. Because if you plant a mango tree, for sure, the farmer won't get it 10 years, because they will receive the money and they'll keep harvesting those fruits, and they'll diversify their livelihoods. So some of those nitty-gritty issues have to be taken into consideration. So not just planting trees, but what type of trees and all of those kind of things, and sustain policy follow-up. So things that will motivate these farmers not to cut those trees and to diversify their livelihoods. Thank you very much.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much for your response. I think also an aspect that can be looked into is looking at indigenous knowledge and incorporating indigenous knowledge during this kind of planning process.
Exactly.
The farmer actually feel like they own the project. So if any other person have a question, you can, I don't see any question in the chat. You can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, may I?
Yes, you can. Please proceed.
Yes, this is Driss Diba from Casablanca, Morocco. First of all, I would like to thank Spring Nature for organizing this awesome webinar. And also I would like to thank my friend Terence for his speech, clear and very instructive for me. I'm not expert. Then I would like to put on the table 2 questions or 2 comments, if you would like. The first one is, I am wondering if we can apply, whether we can apply this approach for North Africa, especially in Morocco, for wheat, for example. We are suffering globally from the same and severe climate impact. And I am asking Terence if we can, or what are the conditions to apply the same approach for wheat in Morocco or North Africa, for example. The second comment is regarding the data he collected, the huge data. Then I'm asking how far this approach or this model is accurate, and how can we fine-tune this approach, taking into account the uncertainties regarding the data. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Driss. I must say, Dr. Chua, Professor Driss is one of our co-authors, one of my senior colleagues at the International Water Research Institute. He's been very supportive, and we're having a lot of projects in the pipeline. So, Professor Driss, thank you very, very much for your comment. Yes, I think the first comment about the applying this kind of an approach in North Africa is something that we would definitely be interesting to look into. I've been thinking about that as well. Looking at the pan, if we're successful in the Pan-Moroccan yield gap atlas, then that's something that we could pull on maybe for a PhD in the future or the postdoc. Yeah, it's an approach that's definitely important to be able to see, for example, the relationships between, at least based on historical data, on how yield gaps are related to precipitation gaps for across the country. It'd be important to see for different regions and to be able to see where gaps, the key yield production regions, and be able to see where the gaps occur the most. So it's definitely taking note of. I think it's going to be very important, because just as the data shows, in as much as the adaptive capacity of most Maghrebian countries, especially in Morocco, for example, and maybe I might state that if you look at the climate performance index, Morocco is amongst the 3 top countries in the world. For example, you have Sweden, Denmark, and the third is Morocco in terms of climate performance index, in the context that they are managing their greenhouse gases, because the index considers greenhouse gas emissions management. It considers energy use and energy policy, and Morocco is third. Egypt is the second African country and appears 22 on the chart. So already the country is already doing a lot, in terms of trying to reduce emissions and make sure that production systems are increasingly efficient. So it will be important for us to go into different regions, maybe beginning from a national scale, to see exactly how, vulnerability, I beg your pardon, how precipitation gaps relate to actual production gaps with different parts of the country. First of all, from a national scale and at different levels. So thank you for that very good observation. I think that it's one of our priorities, and inshallah we'll go into that. Now, concerning the data. So for this our study, of course, the data was obtained first of all from the FAO for the yield gap data, the maize production data. FAO has really been doing a lot of work for most countries, but you mentioned something about accuracy, which is definitely an issue. There are studies that have analyzed, that have compared the data from the FAO and say remote sensing data to be able to see whether what remote sensing is saying is similar to what the kind of data that, in terms of the areas covered, the areas of production or the actual tons of, say, maize, for example, is obtained. And some of these studies have criticized the data as being coerced, because in some cases some of the governments report this data, and sometimes how reporting, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, is difficult. Whereas again, if you look at other regions of Africa, like the Maghreb, most of North Africa, East Africa, and Southern Africa, their reporting systems are advanced, and that's why before the year closes, they have this data. FAO has it, because sometimes FAO in West Africa has to go around using previous years to do a lot of estimation. So if you look at the African picture, you would say that for the crop production data like maize and other crops, the higher uncertainties are within the African region. So when the data doesn't come, FAO has to go ahead and use different methods to fill in the gaps. There was, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't talk about this paper because it's getting ready. I and Dries were co-authors in this paper that we did together, where there was a lot of missing data, and there are methods like interpolation that could be used, regression methods could be used to go into the future and things like that. So those are some of the things. So now there's no longer a lot of, people can't really say there's data because science has evolved a lot. And if you have for a couple of years, and you have a couple of years backwards with missing data, it's still possible to interpolate and, estimate. In as much as you specify that that's what you have done, then it's okay for science because those are the conditions under which you're working. So those are some of the things that we can use to handle that kind of uncertainty. But for the climate data, it's reported by the World Bank Climate Portal, which is really highly backed by most of these great modeling projects like this. I think most of their data right now is based on the SMEP5 analysis, stuff like that. And so the uncertainties have been taken care of. They're working with those experts to carry out most of the calculations. And their error and level of uncertainty will be accurate, will be minimal, and mostly associated to what you would describe in most projected climate data for growing seasons across most parts of Africa. So yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah,
for that
I think we have a couple of people who have actually raised their hand, so maybe we should try to at least give them a chance as well. So I would like to ask Dr. Rafi Babu to actually mute and ask his question.
Yeah, good evening, Chair. Thank you for allowing me and such a wonderful, research topic. It's very important for us also. I'm from India. As you know, India is having a different climatic zones. So I would like to know how this model is going to also work out, and such a having different climatic models in the climatic zones. So we have a different climatic zones if you go to the entire India. I just want to listen from you how this model is going to be impact, and it is a very we are also happy to take out those models and apply in different zones and see the accuracy point of view also. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for your question. I think it's pertinent that you want to see how most of the techniques we have used will be applicable in most of the zones. I'm not very sure about the climate, but I think that yes, especially for the process-based models, you could easily adapt it to the situation in India, for example. If you use like aquacrop, one of those type of models, it could enable you, of course, at a catchment area scale for a particular region. It could be calibrated in there, in as much as, or even the eco crop model, even as much as you have an organized system wherein you can easily measure, on a daily time step basis, changes in evapotranspiration and nutrients and all those type of things. So definitely you can adapt, especially the aquacrop. But concerning this our study, I also think that it's a very pragmatic approach. Just as Professor Dries said, that you can apply. You can also apply this, at a national scale in India. If you can code the data, and just to let you know, if you go on FAO stats, you can get data for any crop, at least from, I can assure you, from 1960 right now to 2020, you can get that data. And if you go on the portal as well, you can also get the precipitation data. You just have to specify the growing seasons and be able to carry out. So definitely it can work. So the data can be, I can assure you, it can be readily accessible because these projects have done a lot of work, and the World Bank is also collaborating a lot, with the African Development Bank and the SMEP modeling processes. So they are backed by all of that, but trying to tailor down this data, not only to Africa, but also to Asia. So India, it's definitely a zone. If you want further guidance on the data and stuff like that, you can always check the publication. You can read it. You can email us, and we're more than happy to get into details on the methodology that will specify that if there's anything that you don't understand, just to be able to compare and see when yield gaps are occurring for any given crop, and how does that relate to the existing precipitation gaps? And if there are not precipitation gaps, maybe going further into identifying the drivers of those gaps. So that things like that. So those are some of our own next steps to be able to account for. Maybe Morocco, for example, will be one region where we'll be doing all of that. So we'll expect emails if you want, and then we can discuss further. You have all our information. And then, yeah, thank you.
Okay, I think you can continue the discussion through email, and maybe you can actually help him.
Exactly.
This. But I think I have one other person who raised his hand. Victor, can you unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. Thank you, Terence, for the good presentation. Actually, attributing yield gaps is difficult, as you pointed out, because there are a number of factors that are in play other than precipitation. And my concern or contribution is more or less like what Professor Dries pointed out about the data. Simply because as much as the way you put it, it's very easy to like adopt this model or this approach elsewhere, be it Morocco or wherever. What's important here, what matters a lot is the input, which is the data. I'll point out, for example, in East Africa, in the place where you have employed projections, which is mainly from CMAP5 and Codex, which is mainly the same data, just downscaled. You notice that if you observe the studies, most studies over East Africa, you'll notice that those models perform poorly over East Africa. Even the latest, the CMAP6 in the next assessment report, IPCC assessment report that will come out, the data that they're using now, if you do an evaluation, it performs badly. So this was just maybe a contribution or an inquiry. I don't know kind of input that you use, if it's possible to use a forecast instead of a projection. Of course, it's over a limited period, but it will actually give you a better result whereby you know the rainfall, you can just do a normalization. So you know whether rainfall will be above normal or below normal, instead of using actual rainfall projected. Because just simply from your results, if I could pick up the year like 1998, there was no yield precipitation gap, simply because the models overestimate rainfall over that region. And you notice 1998 was an El Nino year. So rainfall was a lot. And it agreed with the models. So generally models overestimate rainfall over the region. And like, I don't know if you have a provision in your model where you can use forecast. And that one will be more accurate. Unlike the input that we are using, which is available anyway, the CMAP and the Codex, which is quite misleading. But that's only for East Africa. I'm sure in other places it will still perform very well. There's only a caution when it comes to East Africa, where those models have known to fail for a long time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Victor, for your input. It's what you've mentioned. It's really pertinent fact with most of the CMAP5 estimations, and the fact that you mentioned that it's better to go into forecasting. I think it's pertinent. Maybe comparing what observed data shows and then what forecast data shows, to be able to see where they agree and disagree. And so all the arguments that you raise are very pertinent. And if you look at most of Africa, I've seen studies in Senegal that are drawing in the same type of conclusion, you know, that you present here. So I think your ideas are really pertinent. The way I'm looking at it, I'm putting that on my agenda that in the future, it'll be important to look at both, like perform full-scale analysis on forecast aspects and then on the observed data and see where we're heading to in terms of that. So I'm appreciative of the fact that you're raising this very pertinent point. And these are some of the weaknesses that we have in some of these very large-scale data sets and modeling projects that we have across the world. So those are some of the things to note. Thank you so much for that. I think that yeah, we can discuss that further and build on that.
Okay, thank you very much for your question. I think we are now over time, but just to add, I think maybe you should also think about bias correction, because I've seen people doing that as well.
Perfect.
Just to try to constrain their input and make sure it's as close to observation as much as possible.
As possible.
Yeah, so that's something that you can think about. So thank you very much, and I want to thank all the participants for actually taking part in the webinar series. And thank you very much for your time. And I think I see another hand. We are about to go, but I think if you, I see two hands. So Elisa, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
No, Cliff, it was just to say congratulations for the presentation. It was really interesting.
Okay.
It was a clapping hand, let's say.
Okay, I thought you had a question. Okay, thank you very much. And I will just stop recording at this point. And then, Dr. Epule, thank you very much for your time and your effort in putting this presentation together. Please,
thank you.
Dr. Epule is also a guest editor for one of the topical collection on this topic. You can check our website and look at the topical collection on this topic. And if you have a paper that you're preparing, please feel free to contact him or contact me, and you can submit to our journal. Thank you very much, and bye-bye to everybody.